Okay. I don't think better than Olive Garden.
Oh,
Say,
Howdy.
So, welcome to the Texans Energy Institute seminar. Today we're very pleased and honored to have Mr. Lewin joining us, talking about putting the pieces together for a reliable and just energy transition. And you can see we're using all the pizza, but because of that, we upgraded today.
I hope I worked.
That already shows his stature. He authors a number of books and articles and news outlets, including Texas Energy and Power Newsletter. He also hosts a very interesting podcast called Energy Capital Podcast. He's a nationally recognized energy expert, so particularly in the electric grid, renewables, energy efficiency, demand response, utility regulation, and pollution reduction. He founded this company, Stoic Energy, as a consulting firm specializing in grid and energy issues in 2018. And previously, he held government and regulatory affair work at Lewin Result, the energy efficiency program implemented almost more than 250 utilities in 40 states and provinces. And prior to that, he was the founding executive director of South Central Partnership for Energy Efficiency as a Resource. George was here, and he worked at Texas legislature for 5 years as a legislative aide, primarily on energy, environment, and climate issues for 3 different elected officials in the House and Senate. So without further ado, let's welcome Doug.
Thank you, Dr. Shi, and thank you all of you for being here. This is a great turnout. I have a lot to say over the next hour, but I'll try to get through it pretty fast so that we can get to questions and discussion. I'll have my contact info at the end. I hope you all will connect on LinkedIn or send me an email or whatever, interested in what all of you are studying here at the Energy Institute. So pleased to see the growth of the Energy Institute here in A&M. It's really, really exciting to see. So I've called this Putting the Pieces Together for Reliable Grid and Just Energy Transition. We're going to go a lot of different directions with this, so bear with me. I think what I'll ask of you, if you don't mind, is to, if you have a clarifying question, if I speak in an acronym, I say something that you're not familiar with, like, hey, I don't know what you just said, stop me for that sort of thing. For bigger questions, I talk a lot. I'll try to pace myself that I'll leave at least 15 minutes at the end. You guys will see how I do. All right, so let's see. Okay. Great. So Dr. Shi mentioned I write this Texas Energy and Power newsletter. He gave me credit for writing books. I haven't written books yet. I am trying to write a book, but that's going to take a long time. But I do write articles, and they are available on Substack. You can find them on DougLewin.com. There's the Energy Capital podcast. I'll probably reference that a few times as I'm going through this. The very first one I recorded was with Commissioner McAdams right after he left UC. We'll talk about why that's important in a minute. So I call this talk Putting the Pieces Together because I think when we're dealing with the reality of energy and electricity in the power grid in Texas post Uri, there are a lot of folks who want there to be one thing, like, hey, if we just do X, and you could fill in the blank, everybody kind of has their own favorite one. I'm guilty of this sometimes because I really like energy efficiency. But energy efficiency will not solve all of the problems. We're going to need some more supply, right? But you can put anything in that blank. There is no one thing. We're going to need a whole lot of pieces. And in this talk, I am not going to talk about every single piece of the puzzle. Some of your favorite solutions may not actually be in there. All right. We're going to go back to, okay. Let me just fix this real quick. Get the slides back up. So I am not going to be able to touch on every single solution that is possible, right? There's just, that's not going to be possible. Am I off? Yeah, I think it's just like yeah, I'm still there, so now I just need to get this back to share. We might actually just do this, because it says this week, I may just. Bear with me 1 second, folks, sorry about that.
Have you run any podcast before? I think Kirk was on a podcast before, right?
Yeah.
What was your experience?
It was good.
I'm good.
Yeah.
Zoom, you can do it. That Zoom wouldn't be able to see it, is that right? Unless they could see it like sort of. Actually. Sorry, everybody. Give us just 1 second to troubleshoot this. Now I'm gonna have to talk even faster with this. And we're. Great. Okay, so, we're gonna talk about a lot of the puzzle pieces, but not all of them. Since a little bit of the theme of this talk is puzzles, I wanna show you this picture and I wanna get you thinking about this. So, this is based on some experiments, some social science experiments done out of the University of Virginia. I don't want you to answer right now, but I want you to think about this. If I gave you a bag of Legos and $1, and I said, I want you to make this structure stable enough that I can put a brick down on top of it and it won't collapse on our little stormtrooper's head. I want to put a brick on top of that and not have it collapse. I give you a bag of Legos and $1. Every Lego you use, you lose 10 cents. You have to pay 10 cents for every Lego you use. So I want you to keep this in your mind and think about this as I go through. If I'm boring, you can like let your mind wander and think back to this. And at the end, I'm going to ask you again how you would have solved that puzzle. So let's talk about the challenges we have in Texas. We had Winter Storm Uri. I would say there are sort of 4 really big challenges. There certainly could be more, but I sort of categorize them as 4. One is the Winter Storm Uri challenge, where you didn't have enough both power plants to serve the load and gas supply, which was one of the biggest problems cited by FERC and NERC in their post-Uri report. We have a lot of outages on the distribution grid. So when people think of grid reliability, they often think of these problems, not enough supply to meet demand, but often don't think of these problems. About 90% of grid outages, sometimes as high as 95%, are this, not this, right? But that lasted 3 days, 4 days, and got everybody's attention. Affordability is a big problem. We're going to talk about this, rising bills, and pollution is a big problem as well. So I think it's reliability, affordability, and sustainability, and you really can't sacrifice any of them. We still have not implemented all the recommendations that were given to us by FERC and NERC. This was the report issued in November 2021 after Winter Storm Uri. One of the things they showed in this report is that a lot of our gas was offline before there were ever power outages. Once we got into power outages, there was kind of a downward cycle. So I would argue if we're going to have a reliable grid, one of the key pieces when you're doing a puzzle, right? You usually start with the corners. Who does puzzles in here? Anybody puzzle? Yeah. So like you do the outline first, right? One of the corner pieces, I would argue, is having a reliable gas supply system. But according to FERC and NERC, we didn't have that during Uri, and I think there's been precious little progress afterwards. We had reliability problems before Uri. This shows the frequency of outages, and you can see that much of Texas is in the darkest blue. That is the worst possible. But this light blue is still, this sort of medium blue, I should say, still means a lot of outages, and some of these white areas are just no data. But a lot of this was on the distribution grid, and this is very important because a lot of the solutions that we're going to talk about deal with all of these. There are some solutions that hit all of these: reliability, resiliency, affordability, and sustainability. Power plants in Texas. Sorry for citing a University of Texas study at A&M. I hope you guys don't everybody just get up and walk out. I got horns down there. If you couldn't see that on the Zoom. 27,000 deaths from power plants in Texas over the last 20 plus years. This is very serious stuff. This one is particularly an egregious one. This is the San Miguel coal plant owned by South Texas Electric Cooperative. Its coal ash retention ponds have been called on the Environmental Integrity Project the worst, the dirtiest in the country. Those contain arsenic, selenium, mercury, all sorts of pollutants that will pollute the groundwater for generations to come, depending on how they're remediated. There is in the other image I had of the four, this one is showing what is the last urban coal plant in America. Anybody want to guess where that is? In Texas. Fort Bend County, not far from here, about 20 miles from downtown Houston. That, according to Rice, now I'm mentioning another rival university, I'm going to be very unpopular here. That one kills 177 people per year. That is one person every other day. And not to be lost in this, affordability. This is from the Dallas Morning News. This is using US Census Bureau data. 45% of Texans self-report having to choose between food, medicine, and paying their power bills. That is way higher than the next closest state. This is not a distinction we want in Texas. So that was the doom and gloom part of it. It's going to get better from here. I'm starting you out at a low point. Don't worry. I don't mean to just ruin your lunch. By the way, we are one of very few states, about 15, 20 states, that do not track the number of electric shutoffs. So if you are a researcher interested in energy affordability, good luck finding out how many people in Texas were shut off for non-payment. We do not collect that information or report it anywhere. You cannot get it. I challenge you. If you can get it, please email me and tell me I'm wrong, because I'd love to see it. We did it for a few months during COVID when they put a moratorium on shutdowns, and then they stopped that. We do not report on how many people are unable to pay their power bill because they're paying for food and medicine. We don't know. One other really big challenge, and we're going to talk about this throughout this talk, what this shows is an ERCOT slide, and this shows that entering the summer of 2022, I know it's a little small for the folks in the back, our peak demand was about 75 gigawatts. Leaving the summer of 2023, we were over 85 gigawatts. This is a problem. It's a blessing and a curse, right? We have a growing state, but to have a peak that is rising that fast makes it very hard to ensure reliability or affordability. All right, so we're going to get into talking about the solutions. And what I'm looking for here primarily is solutions that can solve multiple of those problems or dare to dream all of them. And there are many. There are many solutions that are available to us that will solve all of those. So again, puzzle, I'm not trying to put every single piece in here. So at the end of this, you'll say, but what about? And yes, there's going to be 100 different things not in this presentation, but let's talk about some of them that are. We need more wind and solar. We need a lot more of it. It does help to lower costs. There was a study by a firm called IdeaSmith that showed that over the last 10 years, wind and solar have saved $31 billion. Basically, what they did was they just backed all the wind and solar out of the grid. They put natural gas in to replace it. And if you did that, we would have had a $31 billion more expensive system. So we need more of that. It does create challenges. It is a variable resource. It is difficult to integrate. We need more transmission. Transmission will help to integrate more renewables. And also there's a cost to it, but there's a cost benefit analysis that can be done there. We could talk more about transmission if you want. Battery storage. This is happening in a major way. Does anybody know in Winter Storm Uri, we had about 300 megawatts of battery energy storage on the grid. Anybody know where we're at today? How much battery storage we have 3 years later?
5,000.
Correct. 5,000 megawatts of battery energy storage is now on the grid. So a nearly 20-fold increase, about a 17-18% increase. It was 17-18x increase, not percent. It was below 300 around the time of year. So this is really amazing. This solves a multitude of problems for reliability, affordability, and sustainability as well. More good news. We are living in an absolutely incredible time to be looking at energy systems and the way things are changing. These are, as I'm sure you'll be familiar, hockey stick growth patterns. This is showing electric car sales and solar PV capacity additions. This is not slowing down. Electric car sales actually are slowing down a little bit as the IRA incentives are causing some, we could talk about that if you want to, but generally globally, we are seeing this. As a matter of fact, the International Energy Agency said 3 years ago, electric car sales were about 1 out of 25. Last year in 2023, they were 1 out of 5. That's in a space of 3 years. Really incredible growth that is happening. On the affordability side as well, I love this particular one. If you're not reading IEA reports, I highly recommend you do. This one's either from the World Energy Outlook or the Pathway to Net Zero. I forget which one, but they're both great reports. I think this is the Pathway to Net Zero report. But what this is showing is they are doing, I think this is really brilliant. What they're doing is they're showing a comparison of EV batteries and solar PV and wind as well, but that's a little less relevant to what we're talking about here, to probably the two preeminent examples of industrial growth and industrial productivity, possibly in the history of humanity. The growth of Ford Model Ts in the 1910s, right? When Henry Ford said you can have any color you want as long as it's black, because he was just churning those things out as quickly as possible. The average annual cost reduction of the Ford Model T over those 10 years was 10%. Aircraft during World War II, right? Building the arsenal of democracy, right? One of the greatest examples of industrial productivity you could possibly imagine. Average annual cost reduction was less than 15% over the space of those 6 years of World War II. Now look at solar PV, 18% cost reduction from 2010 to 2020. EV batteries, 19% cost reduction, more than the cost reduction by 2x of the Ford Model T, right? Above the line, you're looking at average annual deployment growth. Again, EV batteries rivaling aircraft during World War II, and PVs pretty close to what the Ford Model T was. I mean, this is an incredible time to be a student or professor or researcher at the Texas A&M Energy Institute. I mean, this energy transition is, there's a lot of hype around it. I think it's underhyped, if anything. I'm really bullish on geothermal. Anybody in here studying geothermal power, geothermal energy? So basically what you're talking about here is using the heat of the earth. You're injecting fluid, it's getting hot, it's coming back up as steam, you're turning a turbine. This is enhanced geothermal is the one that I'm talking about here. Interestingly, it takes drilling to very great depths, and it takes, for many of the companies that are doing this, like Fervo out of Houston, who I interviewed in a podcast I used to do with Renewable Energy World called Texas Power Podcast. Highly recommend listening to that one. Tim is great. He's the CEO of a company called Fervo, and he talked about how this is the same skill set as oil and gas workers. You're actually drilling down in Texas. You got to get down to 12 to 13,000 feet to get to hot enough rock. The reason we're seeing this happening in Utah and California, some other places, because that heat is not so deep, right? You got to go deeper here. It's going to take more money. It's going to take longer time period for us to get to that resource, but it's a pretty good resource in the state of Texas. This report goes into that. So I think that this is a key solution. The other really cool thing about geothermal, unlike wind and solar, unless they're paired with battery storage, you can actually vary the flow of the output. So they can actually take that heat and steam and hold it underground. So at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun's high, we have plenty of power, more than we know what to do with. We hold that under the ground as the sun is setting, but maybe it's summertime and it's still a lot of demand. You can then allow that to release. So it is a variable resource in the best way, sort of a dispatchable or flexible resource. Long duration energy storage. I showed batteries earlier. We're going to need long duration as well. Okay, so this one is showing, this is a company called Cavern Energy Storage, and it's basically a form of pumped hydro, right? They're just moving water. We don't have, like in the Pacific Northwest, where you have a lot of geologic formations where you can move water up and down, but we do have a lot of caverns and you can move the water within there. So I think these are all core solutions, but let's talk about a couple of others. So those are all supply side. Now let's look at the demand side. And I know some of you are studying the demand side. Who besides Dr. Shi, because I know he knows, who knows what this is? What are you looking at here? Say it again. Resistive heating. It is resistive heating. That is exactly correct. So this kind of a heater is basically what gets installed very commonly in Texas. So most homes will have an air source heat pump that is designed to heat the home down to 32 degrees. And at 32 degrees, this kicks in. This is a toaster oven or a hairdryer, but sized to heat an entire home. I was at the ERCOT Market Summit a week or two ago, and gentlemen from NRG Energy, they own Reliant Energy. They do analysis of their customers. He said that for their customers at 20 degrees, if they have this, they will use 3 times as much power as at 40 degrees. 20 degrees to 40 degrees, 3 times as much power. You want to guess how many homes this is in? 3.5 million homes in Texas, and we are still building them with this in it. This particular graph was in the FERC and NERC report. This shows auxiliary heating. This is on a Celsius scale. So this is 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Similarly to what the guy said at the conference, you can see that a home at 100 degrees Fahrenheit will use about 5 kW. A home with resistive heat will typically get into the 10 to 20 kW, 2 to 4 times as much power at 14 degrees as at 100 degrees. Times that by 3.5 million. See why we had Winter Storm Uri? Yes, there was not enough supply. There was also way too much demand. In the last 3 years, the state of Texas has done nothing to solve this problem. Not yet. I'm hopeful that that will change. But for now, we still haven't addressed it. By the way, it was a recommendation that FERC and NERC made that we should address it. The Wall Street Journal had this headline: Texas has an obvious affordable fix. Again, I would represent this as one of the pieces. I don't think it's the only piece. I do think we need more supply, but I really do think that the demand side shows a huge potential. This is showing the amount of gigawatt reduction you could get replacing electric furnaces with Energy Star heat pumps. This also includes, this is from an ACEEE study. I can share it with you later if you're interested in it. And they show their math for what the cost of all this stuff is. The attic insulation and ceiling and insulation is very important to that because obviously if you just do the heat pump, but you're allowing that heat or cool heat in the winter time or cooling in the summertime to just leach out to the outside air, you haven't made nearly as big as an impact as you might otherwise. Heat pumps are a great solution to this. And while this isn't quite on the hockey stick that EV sales and PV are, it's getting there. And the data from 2023 just came out, and heat pumps did again exceed gas furnaces. So you can see for most, of the last 20 years, that has not been true. Crossed, in 2021, 2022 has continued. And these are I believe, global. This is United States. But the global numbers also, heat pumps have passed gas furnaces for the first time in the last couple of years. They're often called cold weather rated heat pumps. Somebody told me recently they're starting to call them all climate heat pumps. I think that's probably a better name. Heat pumps, and without getting too much, because we don't have enough time for it, but without getting too much into the physics of it and all that, and you guys would know this better than me, I hope, because I don't know it very well, but basically you're not creating heat like you are with a resistive heater, you're moving heat. So its coefficient it can of performance can go much higher. Even in cold weather, it tends to be at least 50%, if not 100% more efficient than the resistance heat. And yes, it works in cold, right? Because at 0 Kelvin, it won't work, right? At 0 Celsius, no problem, it can still work. And this is, the technology is getting better as we go. What is the cost comparison here for energy efficiency? So during the legislative session, the legislature passed a bill, Senate Bill 2627. It then went on to the ballot. If you voted, who in here voted in November? So y'all need to vote. Everybody vote, please. I don't mind who you vote for, but make sure you vote. There was a constitutional amendment on the ballot in November that authorized, and it passed 2-1, that's 65% or 67% or something like that, to spend $10 billion on gas plants. Actually, about 1.8 billion of that is going to go to microgrids, and we could talk about that, but about 8 billion of it is going to go towards gas plants. That, it was originally going to be 10 billion. That will get you about 10 gigawatts of supply. The cost for heat pumps would be about 500 million. I used to actually show this slide as only 500 million, but I went ahead and added 2 billion because that's what ACEEE shows we would need to really scale insulation. So this is insulation and heat pump change outs. And this is just basically providing an incentive when somebody's AC breaks, right? So 7% of ACs break every year, that you have an average useful life of about 15 years. When they break, you give somebody an incentive to either get rid of the resistance heat or to have it only work in a very extreme situation if you're like below 0, and then it would only kick on just a little bit because you'd have that all climate heat pump. This is what it would cost to reduce demand as opposed to increasing it. All right, I want to transition and talk a little bit about the history of the electric grid, and hopefully you'll see why this is relevant. So it says on the page, but assuming you couldn't read on the top, does anybody know who this is? Anybody recognize this man? If you're studying electric grids, I highly recommend you know who this is. Everybody's heard of Thomas Edison. Everybody's heard of Nikola Tesla. You've probably heard of George Westinghouse. Not that many people have heard of Sam Insel, but I would argue to you that Sam Insel is more important for the electric grid we have today than Tesla, Edison, and perhaps Westinghouse even combined, because he did a couple of different things, one of which was actually create the utility monopoly. We're not going to talk about that much today, but for that reason alone, he's probably even more important. This book really focuses on him, Sam Insel. This one goes much deeper into the history of power, going back and looking at like steam, the early steam engines, all the way back to like James Watt, and then coreless engines. And this is showing the, I believe this is an image of the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So Sam Insel works for Tom Edison. He's his right-hand man for about a decade. It's a very consequential decade when Edison is turning on the Pearl Street Station in 1882, the first power plant anywhere in the world. He leaves there and goes to Chicago in 1892. The Chicago World's Fair happens in 1893. It would be hard to overstate how stunning this was to people, right? If you were living in a world where there wasn't electric light and then you walk into these massive halls and everything is illuminated, and you can see on their posters how prominently that lighting was being displayed. And Westinghouse actually, and this is detailed in those books, both Power Makers and Merchant of Power, Westinghouse spends a lot of money to win the contract to electrify all of this. Insel comes in and buys all that equipment for pennies on the dollar and uses it for some of the first power plants that he opens up, including the Fisk Street Station, which was about 5 megawatts. Today, right, that would seem extremely small, right? That wouldn't even come close to like powering this campus, much less an entire city like Chicago. But at the time, 5 megawatts is quite big. This says 1907, but this one was actually completed much earlier in the 1890s. And of course, the advertising, right? The sort of like goddess of liberty kind of figure, right? That people would be freed up from electricity, okay? But let's think about this. If you're Sam Insel and you are starting to build these power stations and they cost a lot of money, a lot of fixed costs, and your predominant load is what? What load are you serving? Lighting. When do people mostly use lighting? At night. What are you going to do with all those power stations during the day, right? So Insel figured out, this is more even than the utility monopoly, though that may be actually be more consequential, but right up there with it on the short list would be he figured out the importance of time of use rates. And he started offering factories like this meat packing plant, but all sorts of factories around Chicago, extremely low rates during the day because he was building the infrastructure for the lights. Traction as well, what they call traction, right? Electric streetcars and trolleys and things like that. He actually started to buy them up and owned all of them. This eventually led to his downfall, by the way, and the passage in the 1930s as part of the New Deal of the Public Utility Holding Control Act, because he was doing a lot of financial innovation as well, which caused his downfall and his bankruptcy, and he died penniless, evading the law. He's a fascinating man. You should read the books. But for the purposes of this time of use rate and electrify everything. Has anybody heard of electrify everything? You're hearing this these days, right? This is sort of a big thing in the energy transition. Insel was talking about electrify everything 110 years ago. But the only way to do it was to have variable rates. I want to remind you of this, right? We are having a problem in Texas keeping up with peak, right? We're having a problem keeping up with peak, but we're about to get a lot more large loads. This is from ERCOT and shows the amount of large loads that they are tracking, just that they're tracking, including 10 gigawatts of hydrogen. This was from a year ago. I've not seen them update it from a year ago. I would suspect that number is much higher today. This is showing data centers. AI data centers use a lot more power than the data, like a data center just to do a Google search takes a fraction of what a data center to do, particularly generative AI. Massive amounts of power will be needed for this. We're already seeing that show up. And then you've got crypto mining, already about 2 or 3 gigawatts, another 20 under study. We're not shown in ERCOT's large load. This is from a study that 6 oil majors funded S&P Global to do for them. It shows that right now in the Permian, we have about 3 or 4 gigawatts of load connected. They expect within 10 years that will more than triple. Why do you think oil and gas operators want to connect to the grid? This shows what their demand is today. They have over 10 gigawatts of demand already, but only 3 or 4 of it's on there. What are they powering it with if it's not powered by the grid? What?
On-site natural gas.
On-site natural gas or could be waste. I don't think there's a whole lot of that going on. Maybe I'm wrong on that. If you know that that's the case, send me some information because I'd love to know. I think a lot of it's diesel gensets and gas gensets, right? But if you're burning your own gas there, it's certainly better than venting or flaring it. But sometimes you're able to move that and sell it. And of course, diesel is extremely expensive. So the point of this, though, is ERCOT is expecting, according to their large flexible load task force, 48 gigawatts. They're not counting another 10 gigawatts from oil and gas, nor are they looking very much at EVs. This is basically showing what So an outdoor stadium, you know, you go to the A&M football game, hopefully for y'all's sake, they're better. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not rooting for them, but I don't want to get run out of the room, so I won't say any more. A stadium will use about 5 megawatts, a small town about 20, a very large industrial plant about 40. This is showing the eventual use of like a large passenger truck stop, mixed use plaza, passenger plaza. I mean, we are talking about very large loads from electric vehicles. If it's in your garage or it's at your workplace or it's here outside the Energy Institute building, that might be flexible because you could be plugged in for a number of hours. If you're at one of these places, that's not flexible, right? If you're driving from city to city, you don't want a signal that says, just wait an hour until power prices. Nope. This is going to be instantaneous demand. But again, keep in mind that the other EVs may not. All right, I've got a few left. And here, I want to point to this. This is from a series of papers that the Energy Systems Integration Group did. And I highly recommend reading all of them. It's a great series. I forget which one this is from, but basically what they're showing is peak to off-peak price ratio and how much reduction you can get with technology or price only. So with technology means it's going to be automated. Nobody has to think about it. Price only is here. You can see that with a 4 or 6x increase, it is not unreasonable to expect you would get a 20% reduction. 20% reduction at peak from these kinds of things. Now, you might say, well, 4 to 6 times, that's a whole lot. Of course, on the wholesale level, we have a price that can go to $5,000. Today, it's probably 0 or 10. We can look it up if you want, but like prices on the grid almost every day now are $10 a megawatt hour. It's a penny a kilowatt hour for wholesale costs. And you're talking about going from 10 all the way up to 5,000. So a 500x increase on wholesale, but on the transmission distribution system. What Insul built out with variable rates, telling people use more when there's plenty available, use less when there's not. We have no differentiation. And by the way, that cost is up to 5 cents. If you're in Houston or Dallas with CenterPoint or Encore, the biggest utilities in the state, you pay 5 cents 2 in the morning. You pay 5 cents 6 p.m. on September 6th when we're in an emergency condition. No different. It makes no sense. And it doesn't just make no sense for us and for having a reliable grid. It makes no sense for CenterPoint or Encore because they could be selling more of their product if they reduce the cost. If they would like to electrify everything, and if I was Encore, I certainly would, right? I want to make that cost lower. And this isn't just me talking. Sam Insull figured this out 120 years ago. There's nothing new under the sun. Right? We just need to learn the examples from history. Pacific Northwest National Lab did this study. If we had a distribution system operator in transactive energy, we're paying people to reduce and sometimes to use more. We've got to get our heads around this, right? Your normal thought of energy efficiency is conservation. Put a sweater on inside your house when it's cold outside. No, that's not what we're talking about. Energy efficiency these days actually means using more when there's more available. Think of electric vehicles. We want to use more electricity. It's still energy efficiency, by the way, because you're not wasting a lot of fuel in the form of heat, which is burned off and not used in any possible way. With electricity, it is. This study showed that if we had these kinds of transactive capabilities on our grid, just in the state of Texas, we would save 3.3 to 5 billion. They based that on a grid with 15 to 20% renewable penetration. Anybody know how much renewable we have right now? 2023, what percent of energy? What is it?
Texas 24, outish.
We're at last year, we were at about 30. Excellent guess. You're right in the range. It was 30% last year. This year will probably be 35. Next year will probably be 40%. And a 40% renewable penetration, this number went up to $6 billion in savings from having a distribution system operate. Let's talk we'll talk a little bit about what that means. So where do these cost savings come from? So some of it is from energy purchases, and not a small amount, right? $700 million is from energy purchases. Some of it is from ancillary services. The distributed energy resources that are now participating in the market are mostly here and here. But with this study, and this is a study called Tapping the Mother Load, it's specifically focused on electric vehicles and integrating them into the grid. It is part of that ESIG series I was just talking about, the Energy Systems Integration Group. Most of the savings are actually coming from capacity, right? We're about to spend as a state $10 billion of your taxpayer money, right? Teachers didn't get a pay raise, but we're going to spend $10 billion on capacity. Look how much we could save if we were using demand responding to wholesale market pricing. But what we're trying to do, and I think this is very important, particularly for those of you working on the demand response study, is we're trying to make demand act like supply and just participating here. And we're losing these savings, and we're losing some of the savings that could be gained in other areas as well. So what does this look like? What is a distribution system operator? Okay, so right now, ERCOT, by the way, is a transmission system operator. ERCOT exists partially, there's a lot of reasons it exists, but one of the reasons is to match buyers and sellers, right? So I've got a power plant, I make an offer for how much somebody can buy my power. I'm a load serving entity. I say how much I'm willing to pay. They match it up, right? They connect the buyer and the seller. We have nothing like that on the distribution. Now think about all these little loads that are coming and all like electric vehicles, all the generation now happening, right? Solar panels, generators on the side of homes. This, I think, really kind of tells the story. If you have, what you're looking at here is load net of wind and solar and total load, right? So if you're a home that has solar panels on it, this is the sort of famous duck curve, right? Your demand is gonna drop a lot in the middle of the day. Since Uri, we've had one emergency on the ERCOT grid. Anybody know what time of day it happened? Anybody want to guess? Yes.
Approximately 1700.
Yeah, a little later. It was about 1800, 1900, because the sun was setting. It was right here. It was 6 or 7. As a matter of fact, like right at about 7 o'clock p.m., we were really, really close to outages on September 6th. If you don't do anything to manage these loads, you're reducing demand when we're up to 22 gigawatts of solar in the state of Texas. It's a crazy thing to say out loud. Never would have imagined it 5, 6 years ago, much less 10 years ago. We're gonna be at 40 within 2 years. This is not a problem. I don't need to reduce here. I need to reduce here. So if you have a this sort of net load strategy where basically you are charging batteries, you're pre-cooling a home in the middle of the day so it doesn't need to use as much. Again, having good insulation will help with that. Look at what they've done. You can actually see the original net load there and look at how much lower it is at that key hour of 7 to 8. We have got to start having this on the demand side. If we don't, we will have more outages in the future. I would argue, again, it's a puzzle. One thing won't solve it, but this is a prerequisite. If we don't do this, we will continue to have problems. There are lots of ways demand, I'm not going to talk about each and every one of these, but demand, flexible demand can do a lot of different things, right? It can actually shape load on the order of seasons and even years, but it can also in the moment shift or shed load, and even down to shimmy, which is basically like frequency regulation, right? That's on the seconds, that's where you're getting into, do you have an electric vehicle battery or a battery on the wall? I just wanted to show this because there are so many, just like with power plants and different forms of power, they have different capabilities. So too on the demand side. So what this is showing is, this is a demand curve. For the longest time, the belief was there's no elasticity of demand, right? But as we start to get electric vehicles out there, there absolutely is much more. There's elasticity now, but there's much more with electric vehicles. Think of how many pools are in the state of Texas. Pool pumps are energy hogs. They use a lot of power. Does anybody care when their pool is the water is moving from the pool pump? Think of all the compressors in refrigerators. And you have a lot of insulation, so you don't need that compressor running all the time, right? Think about September 6th, we were almost in outages. Every pool pump in the state could have been running at that key hour. Why? There's no pricing, right? The assumption is there's no elasticity of demand, but there's tons of elasticity. Who cares when their pool pump runs? Now, let's start bending that curve. Let's start finding out what the price for a different demand is. And this is where part of the just energy transition comes into this. We can, and remember the 45% of Texans that struggle with their bills, we do not need to overbuild a system to meet every single peak if we can have demand curves bending. Okay, so this shows if there was even more, and when you get through to this is in this report, if you want to read more about this and the explanation around it, what you start to get to is a smoother supply curve without these massive peaks, because you are including more demand. It's a basic principle of markets, right? The more resources you put into a market, the more competitive it is, the lower prices are going to go. Right now, we have a market that does not include demand. If you include demand and you bend that demand curve, you are bringing prices down for everybody, even if they don't participate. Texas is dipping a toe in this. There is a virtual power plant pilot, and as a matter of fact, next week's ERCOT board meeting, there will be a recommendation from the Reliability and Markets Subcommittee. They filed their papers yesterday saying we should allow these virtual power plants to earn revenues in the ERCOT Contingency Reserve Service. This is a new ancillary service. This is a great step forward, but I would just remind you that what we are talking about here is a very narrow set. We are talking about capturing value from the energy market and from the ancillary service markets, but not giving any capacity value, not giving any value for the deferral of distribution infrastructure. My most recent podcast I recorded with the executive vice president of CenterPoint Energy. CenterPoint covers 3% of the land mass in the state of Texas, but 25% of the peak demand. That peak demand is a little over 20 gigawatts. They expect within the next 2 decades that will double or triple under a moderate electrification scenario. How much distribution infrastructure will we have to build out to meet all that if we do not have an active demand side? The cost will be prohibitive. People will be unable to pay. The inverse is true. If we do this, and we do it in a much bigger way, costs will go down. You guys remember this guy? Who's got an answer? I'm going to charge you a dime for every Lego you use. We want to put a brick down on top of that blue platform. How do you make that stable enough that it doesn't collapse on its head? Anybody have any guesses? No guesses at all? Somebody's got it. I mean, there's no like wrong, I mean, I guess there are wrong answers, but like, I mean, you're trying to make it stable. There's really not any wrong answers. Like we'll brainstorm. What do you think? How would you make this stable?
One could argue it's already stable and you don't have to add a brick because the wall's already protecting the person.
Well, but if I put a brick down on it, you see how there's like one back here, right? So a brick, and these are Legos, you got to think it's probably going to collapse this way. Maybe. I mean, you could try it, I guess, right? You could try it and see.
Take out the green brick.
Take out the green brick. See that? Yeah.
I was thinking we could make the guy lie down and then.
I like that. You're thinking outside the box. I like that. I like that. So if it collapsed, it wouldn't hurt him. So when they did these experiments at the University of Virginia, only about 20% of people came up with this. When they prompted the research subjects and said, you can use Legos or remove Legos, about 50 to 60% got it. Maybe I should have given you that prompt. You're exactly right? If you remove this and then you set that blue right on top, now it's on top of this huge wide structure, right? Very unlikely it's going to collapse. Most people will give answers like build a pillar here, build a pillar here, build a pillar here, right? What this is showing, and there's a whole book by a researcher at the University of Virginia named Leidy Klotz called Subtract. And he talks about several different examples, one of which is you guys seen those little glider bikes that little 2- and 3-year-olds are wheeling around on? Instead of adding training wheels, they just took the pedals off altogether. And it's, right? So as humans, we are primed for whatever reason, there's probably really good like biological reasons why, to add when there's a problem. We must add something. We must have more.
right? And I would argue that's what's going on in the state of Texas right now with our push to get more, or legislators push, policymakers push to get more power plants online. The inverse is true. We often neglect the solutions that are less or subtracting. Almost all the time, we neglect those solutions. You can probably see examples of this in your own life, right? If you think about it, usually when you have a problem, you're going to add something. But I would challenge you to think both in your personal life, your professional life, whatever, about sometimes using less. I would argue in the case of the electric grid, we need both. We need to do less and we need to do more. In other words, we need to reduce demand and we need more supply. The key, though, is having this grid where there is this interactive part of it with demand, so that if we go back to the time of Insole, we are actually encouraging people to use more power. And then we are heading to a world very quickly, we're probably there already, where 80 to 90% of the hours out of the year are dirt cheap. Zero. We should look at ERCOT. If you look at the ERCOT dashboard today, I bet it's zero or close to it today, right? Use more during those times, but use less during the peak, or even more importantly, the net peak, which is the total demand minus the wind and solar. And with that, this is my contact info, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you for a very, very interesting talk and very, very thought-provoking. Any questions, comments, Sean?
So thanks for the presentation. I hope we can get the presentation if you don't mind.
Yeah,
Share it with us. So you mentioned that there is no, in Texas, we don't have a peak price based on time, like 7 p.m. will be the same as 6 a.m. But we have a peak price for kilowatt tariff, is that right, in Texas?
What?
Tariff for kilowatt?
So there is a differentiation in the wholesale market. But what I was saying is, on the transmission distribution side for residential and small commercial customers, there is no difference. It's 5 cents. Does that make sense? If you're a large customer, there is some difference.
So commercial is different from the peak, right, for the kilowatt?
So
based on the tariff I'm talking, where you pay, where you hit, and then they define, they choose a price based on that peak for kilowatt.
So there's 2 different things. For if you're a large user, you take your electricity at transmission voltage. Your bill is 2 components: the energy, right, which you can sign a bilateral contract for, or you can go on the spot market and buy it. Most people are gonna. And then the other part is transmission distribution, and that is determined. You guys ever heard the term 4 coincident peak? 4CP, right? So that is, there are the 4 intervals: June, July, August, September, 1 in each. When the system hits its peak, in that 15 minutes, however much you are using as a large customer, in each of those months, that's 1/4 of your bill, right? Add up those 4 intervals divided by 4, that's your transmission charge for the next year. So some large users will completely shut down and they'll have a $0 transmission. So it's a big cost shift. The independent market monitor believes that that should end because it shifts cost to all the rest of us. I do think they at a minimum need to change it from 4 coincident peak to 4 coincident net peak, because 5 p.m., as we were talking about earlier, 5 p.m. isn't the problem. And in the summertime, we're gonna have plenty of solar at 5 p.m. 7 p.m., different story, but you can literally have big users reducing their use at 5 and then using more at 7, and the economic incentive would tell them to do so, but that could actually crash over. I don't know if that was your question.
Yeah, you mentioned if there is no base, or we don't have the number. I think in Texas we flare about $2.5 billion per year.
Flaring of natural gas.
Yes, and then we did it with Radar Commission, and we feel interested we can do the same thing. We can get the data from Radar Commission. And one more thing you mentioned about electricity production, I think 30% is right, but at the same time in West Texas we dump about 50%, so it used to be 50%. So the question is how much we dump. Okay, well, we produce 30% is coming from renewable, but how much is gonna store use per year, and how much do we dump?
Because of congestion, because it's not able to get where it needs to go, which is why transmission, I went over a lot of these slides very fast. We do need more transmission. Congestion is a huge and curtailment are a big problem. Interestingly, though, a lot of these large loads are locating in West Texas. And I think there's a real hope, not just Bitcoin miners, but hydrogen. There's a water problem with hydrogen, but data centers, things like that, that they are able to locate nearer to the generation so that we don't have those problems as much, and we need more transmission. It's a great point.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions, disagreements? What I say
One
that
of
was
the
just
things you
wrong?
mentioned about,
Yeah.
maybe I can just say that, is
Yeah.
Ingso's idea very much still true up until today. But you came up with these ideas and fiascos like greedy.com, in which they're exactly trying to do the thing and then they hit a political wall.
Yes,
And so what's
yes.
your comment on that?
I love that question. So you all familiar with Griddy? So Griddy was a retail electric provider that just had pass through of wholesale costs directly to their customers, which on most days is great. They would add the T&D charge, right? So if power prices are zero today, your charge would be just the T&D, just the 5 cents, and that would be it. It worked great for their customers until Winter Storm Uri, when prices went to $9,000 a megawatt hour, which is $9 per every kilowatt hour you use. People were ending up with $1,000, several $1,000 electric bills. And Griddy was actually texting and emailing their customers before Uri saying, switch. Get away from us because this is going to be bad. And it was bad. So clearly, there have to be consumer protections and guardrails around that. You cannot expose residential and small commercial customers to, now the cap is from 9,000 down to 5,000, but still you can't expose people to $5,000. So there have to be some sort of guardrails around that. But if you look at that chart that shows the amount of savings that come in, 4 to 6, if your average price is 13 cents and you're going to pay 60 or 70 cents, that's a lot, but it's not $9, right? So and that's where this would be. So I think having some variable rates, and this is already starting to happen. We already see it with there's diurnal ones, right? Where these are really popular. I guess you guys don't shop here because you have Bryan College Station. But if you're outside of that area and you do shop, you'll see a lot of these free nights kinds of programs, which I think as people get more electric vehicles will become more. I actually don't think they're a great deal for consumers right now because the day price is like 22 cents or something like that. Whereas you could get it, 14 cents otherwise. So unless you're using a lot of power overnight, it's probably not a great deal, but just having some variability and some price signal. And ultimately, this part of this matters, the price only versus the with technology. Notice that you get, a much bigger impact. I actually think over time, we're going to see this, ironically, because of AI, which is going to drive a lot of load. Like you'll see AI managing the devices. It becomes what in the industry they call set it and forget it, where I talk to you as a customer one time and I say, do you care when your water is heated? No, I just want hot water when I turn the shower and I don't care. Okay, great. If I gave you $10 a month to put a device on your hot water heater, would that be okay? Yeah, I'll take $10 a month for that, right? And then you don't have to think about it, but that hot water heater will not be heating up water on a cold winter morning when we're about to go into power outages. It would have been heated during the night when we had plenty of wind power and nuclear and everything else, right? So a question here and then a question over and then.
Sorry, so the thing is, most of this is just on the paper. Today, you can't go do anything without the load serving entities. Like if I want to do load reduction, help a bunch of customers, just residential customers, get into the market and participate in the market. If I'm an aggregator, I can't do that without the load serving entities. So it just comes down to them, like why bother other people when they are the one controlling everything?
So there should be there's some limited ability for aggregators. It's not much, you're right. It's mostly through the load serving entities, which is why Tesla, who really pushed the virtual power plant
He got
pilot.
back from Tesla for 6 months of interview.
Did you? Okay, so they set up a retailer. Did you work on that side of it?
But yeah, the VPP is actually peanuts. I mean, how much is that? Like
It's
a
about-
few megawatts.
Yeah, 13 megawatts at this point. So it's tiny, and the cap is 80. So, yeah, and look, and this is why I'm emphasizing here, this, right? That like, there's, money here, there's a lot of money here, right? And I actually think there's probably a lot more as well on the distribution system deferral side. So we've got to start valuing that as well. But no, look, I mean, I think there's huge potential in the retail market for this. And I think, NRG is an interesting one to watch. They bought a company, I'm forgetting their name right now. It'll come to me in a minute, but they bought a company for a few $1 billion that is basically an alarm company. But the reason that an energy company bought an alarm company is because basically it has smart home technology built into it. And they want to start selling that service to their customers and reducing the amount they've got to hedge to go out and buy generation. So I do think the load serving entities are the main avenue where this will come through. But I think we've got to figure out how to realize some of the capacity value and the distribution system value. Because otherwise it's going to remain very low level because we're not tapping into the bigger areas of value.
In the interest of time, let's get
Yes.
one last question from Costas, and then we can have a more informal discussion. People feel free to leave.
So Doug, I was impressed for the slide that you presented 50% of population in Texas has difficulty decide if they are going to pay their bills or pay for their medicine, their medication. And from the other side, there are savings of 2.53 billion due to the different solutions that you presented. So that in my let's say economic thinking is that either the average salary is very low compared to other states, which I don't believe, or that the companies provide energy are charging quite high prices.
So there's two things. One, I think our average income is lower than I mean, mean versus median and that kind of thing. We have a lot of people on the high end, but there are quite a few people in those sub 40, 50,000 range. The IRA, which we didn't even talk about in this talk, which is kind of wild to think about. There's so much going on in this space, but the Inflation Reduction Act does provide $690 million for Texas for energy efficiency for folks that income qualify. It's based on average median income. So that will help a lot on that energy efficiency side. Are the energy companies charging a lot for energy? Our rates are roughly average. Our bills are actually sixth highest in the country. We're near Connecticut. Connecticut famously has really high for bills, right? And the reason is even if your rate is low, but your summers, does this sound true to anybody? Last forever. It's going to be 82 degrees this week, right? I mean, so in February. So we use a lot of energy. So even though our rates are kind of average, our bills are among the highest in the country. And of course, people pay the bills. It's the number at the bottom that they owe the company.
It's $1, not $1 per megawatt hour.
That's right.
So
That's right.
anyway, let's thank the speaker very
Thank
much.
you.
And Professor Cristiano,
That was so good to see you.
Well, you are. Yeah, you're gonna be around.
That's a lot of work. That's you, not